My husband wants me to kick my dying son out of the house and called him a burden, but he discovered that my son owns half of it. When my son Nate got diagnosed with leukemia at 24, he had to move back home for treatment. My husband Carl immediately started complaining. He's an adult. He should figure this out himself. I didn't sign up to live with your grown kid. The house belonged to me from my late husband, but Carl acted like Nate was invading his personal space. This was supposed to be our fresh start together, not a nursing home for your son. Carl would do these passive-aggressive things to make Nate feel unwelcome. He'd cook dinner for just the two of us and tell Nate there wasn't enough food. When Nate was too weak from chemo to make himself something, Carl would say, "Your mother isn't your servant. You have working hands." He'd blast music at 6 in the morning, knowing Nate was nauseated and needed rest. When I asked him to keep it down, he'd say, "I'm not changing my routine because your adult son can't handle real life." The worst was when Nate had treatments. Carl would complain about having to see medical equipment in his house. He'd make gagging noises when Nate threw up from the chemo. This is disgusting. Can't he do that somewhere else? He'd spray air freshener directly at Nate and say the sick smell was ruining his appetite. When Nate lost his hair, Carl bought him a hat that said "freeloader" and left it on his bed. "Just a joke," he said when I confronted him. "Someone needs to keep spirits up around here." Carl started trying to charge Nate rent. He's living here for free. That's not teaching him anything about responsibility. When I reminded him that Nate couldn't work because he was fighting cancer, Carl said, "Plenty of sick people still contribute. He's just using his illness as an excuse to be lazy." He'd leave printouts of apartment listings on Nate's bed. Circle Help wanted ads and tape them to his door. Tell him about friends whose kids were successful and independent. Tommy's son just bought his own house, but I guess some kids are raised to be achievers and others are raised to expect handouts. One day, Nate's white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, and he had to be extra careful about germs. Carl deliberately invited his poker buddies over, 6 guys smoking cigars and coughing everywhere. When I begged him to cancel, he said, "This is my house too. I'm not going to stop living because your son has a weak immune system." Nate ended up in the hospital with an infection that almost killed him. While Nate was in the ICU, Carl told me this was a sign. Maybe it's time to look into long-term care facilities. This isn't working for anyone. He actually brought me brochures for nursing homes. They have trained professionals. It would be better for everyone. That's when I remembered something important. The house wasn't just from my late husband. It was specifically willed to me and Nate. Carl had no legal claim to it at all. I'd never put him on the deed because my late husband wanted to make sure his son always had a home. I called my brother-in-law, who was a real estate attorney, asked him to pull all the paperwork. Sure enough, Nate legally owned half the house. Carl was basically just a guest who happened to be married to me. When Nate got out of the hospital, Carl was waiting with more apartment listings. I found some places with disability access. You could probably afford them with government assistance. That's when I told him to pack his things. Carl laughed. "You're kicking me out? Your husband? Over your freeloading son?" I showed him the deed. "This house belongs to me and Nate. You don't own anything here. You're the one freeloading. And now you're leaving." Carl's face went red. "You can't be serious. I'm your husband. I have rights." My brother-in-law walked in right then with eviction papers. "Actually, you don't. You're not on the deed. You have no rental agreement. You're here at the homeowner's discretion, and both homeowners want you gone." Carl tried everything. He cried about how he'd paid for groceries sometimes, how he'd fixed the garage door once, how he'd invested emotionally in making this his home. I gave up my apartment for this. Where am I supposed to go? Nate spoke up for the first time in months. His voice came out rough and thin, barely more than a whisper, but every word landed like a hammer. "You can go straight to hell, Carl." I stared at my son. This kid who'd always been so polite, so careful with his words even when he was little. Carl's whole face changed color, going from that angry red to this deep purple that made the veins in his forehead stand out. He opened his mouth, probably to yell, but my brother-in-law moved forward before Carl could get a word out. He held up the eviction papers, the official ones with the court seal and everything. "You have 72 hours to remove your belongings from the property. That's 3 days, starting right now." Carl turned to look at him, then back at me, then at Nate. His hands were shaking and he kept clenching and unclenching his fists. "This is insane. You can't just throw me out like garbage." My brother-in-law stayed calm, like he was explaining something simple to a kid. "Actually, we can. You're not on the deed. You never signed a rental agreement. You don't pay rent. Legally, you're a guest, and both homeowners want you to leave." Carl started pacing back and forth in the living room, his shoes making these heavy thuds on the floor. "I need more time. 3 days isn't reasonable. Where am I supposed to find a place in 3 days?" He turned to me with this desperate look. "I'm your husband. Doesn't that count for something? Don't I have rights?" My brother-in-law shook his head. "Spousal rights don't override property ownership. The house belongs to your wife and her son. You have no legal claim to it. You've been living here at their discretion, and that discretion has been revoked." I stood up from the couch and walked over to where Carl was standing. He looked at me like I might change my mind, like maybe I'd see how upset he was and back down. You can take whatever is clearly yours. Your clothes, your personal stuff, anything you brought into this house, but anything we bought together stays here because you contributed almost nothing financially over the years. Carl's eyes went wide. That's not fair. I paid for things. I fixed stuff around here. I felt this cold anger settle in my chest, the kind that makes you really clear-headed instead of confused. You fixed the garage door once. That doesn't give you ownership of our furniture. He started to argue, opening his mouth to list off all the things he thought he deserved, but something in my face must have stopped him. Maybe he finally saw that I was done, that no amount of talking or crying or threatening would change my mind. He looked at me for another few seconds, then turned and stomped down the hallway toward the bedroom. Doors started slamming, one after another, and I could hear him muttering under his breath about how ungrateful we were, how he gave up everything for this family, how nobody appreciated him. Nate was still sitting on the couch, and when I walked back over, I saw his hands were shaking. Not just a little tremor, but really shaking, like all the adrenaline from standing up to Carl was hitting him at once. I sat down next to him and took his hand in both of mine. His skin felt cold and papery, the way it always did after chemo when his circulation got bad. "You okay?" I asked him, keeping my voice quiet. He nodded, but didn't say anything. I could feel him trembling, this whole body shake that came from pushing himself past what his body could handle. Standing up to Carl had taken everything he had, and now he was paying for it. My brother-in-law sat down in the chair across from us and waited until the slamming sounds from the bedroom stopped for a minute. "I'm going to stay for a while. Make sure everything goes smoothly. Do you have plans for dinner?" I realized I hadn't even thought about food. The whole confrontation had pushed everything else out of my mind. "I don't know. I could order something." He pulled out his phone and started looking at delivery options. "Let me take care of it. You two just sit here and breathe for a minute." While he scrolled through restaurant menus, I kept holding Nate's hand. The shaking was starting to ease up a little, but he still looked exhausted. Carl came back out of the bedroom carrying a box of his stuff and shot us this look full of anger and hurt. He set the box down by the front door with a loud thump, then went back for more. My brother-in-law looked up from his phone. "We should probably have a police officer here when he actually moves out, just to make sure everything stays peaceful." I nodded. "Can you arrange that?" He tapped something on his phone. "I'll make some calls tomorrow. We'll schedule it for the 3rd day. Give him the full 72 hours, but make sure he leaves on time." Carl made another trip past us with a laundry basket full of clothes. He was moving fast, angry movements, grabbing things and shoving them into bags without any care. More doors slammed. More muttering about betrayal and ingratitude. My brother-in-law ordered Chinese food from that place on Main Street that Nate used to like before he got sick. When it arrived, we sat at the kitchen table and ate while Carl continued packing in the other room. Nate managed a few bites of rice, which was more than he'd eaten at dinner in weeks. "How are you feeling?" my brother-in-law asked him. Nate put down his fork and looked at his plate. "Tired, but good. Like I should have said something months ago." I squeezed his shoulder. "You said it when it mattered. That's what counts." We spent the rest of the evening planning the next few days. My brother-in-law wrote everything down in his phone, making a list of what needed to happen and when. Call the police department tomorrow morning. Schedule the officer for day 3. Change the locks immediately after Carl leaves. Make sure I had copies of all the legal documents. Check that Carl wasn't trying to take anything that belonged to me or Nate. That night, after my brother-in-law left and Nate went to bed, I lay in the guest room listening to Carl bang around in our old bedroom. He was making as much noise as possible, slamming drawers and dropping things on purpose. But instead of making me anxious like it usually did, the sound just made me feel relieved. Every bang was one step closer to him being gone. I realized I was sleeping better than I had in months, even with all the noise. Just knowing he'd be out of here soon made everything feel lighter, like someone had lifted this heavy weight off my chest that I'd gotten. So used to carrying I forgot it was there. The next morning, Carl showed up at breakfast with red eyes and a crumpled tissue. He sat down across from me and Nate without saying anything at first, just staring at his empty plate. Then he started talking about how he couldn't sleep all night, how he kept thinking about all his mistakes, how he wanted to go to counseling if I'd just give him another chance. His voice cracked on the last part, and he reached across the table like he was going to take my hand. I pulled back before he could touch me. I told him it was too late for counseling, that watching him deliberately put Nate in danger with the poker party wasn't something therapy could fix. That kind of cruelty didn't come from stress or misunderstanding. Nate set down his fork and looked directly at Carl for the first time since the eviction papers got served. He said Carl had months to show basic human decency and chose cruelty every single time, that he was done being treated like a problem in his own house. Carl's face shifted from sad to angry in about 2 seconds. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loud against the floor, started saying we were both ungrateful and that he gave up his whole life to be here. My brother-in-law's car pulled into the driveway right then, which cut off whatever else Carl was about to say. Carl grabbed his coffee mug and went back to the bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. The rest of that day felt long and tense. Carl stayed in the bedroom most of the time, only coming out to grab more boxes from the garage or use the bathroom. Every time he walked past us, he'd mutter something under his breath. Not quite loud enough for me to catch the words, but the tone made it clear he was angry. I stayed in the living room with Nate, helping him sort through some of his old college textbooks to pass the time. Nate looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and his hands shaking slightly when he tried to lift anything heavy. The confrontation at breakfast had taken more out of him than I realized. Around 3 in the afternoon, Carl came out carrying a box of his clothes and stopped in the doorway. He looked at Nate and said something about how some kids appreciate what their parents do for them, how other kids just take and take until there's nothing left. I stood up and told him to finish packing without the commentary. He laughed this bitter sound and said I'd regret choosing a grown man over my husband, that Nate would probably move out the second he felt better and I'd be alone. Then he'd be the one laughing. Nate didn't respond, just kept his eyes on the book in his lap. I could see his jaw clenched tight, but he didn't take the bait. That seemed to make Carl even angrier. He set the box down with a thump and started listing all the things he'd done for us. Fixed the garbage disposal last year, painted the guest bathroom, bought groceries every other week. Like those basic household tasks somehow balanced out months of psychological torture. My brother-in-law called around 4 to check in. I told him Carl was still packing but getting more aggressive with his comments. He said he'd come by tomorrow morning to make sure everything stayed under control, that I should call the police if Carl tried anything tonight. After dinner, which Carl refused to join us for, Nate had his scheduled chemo appointment coming up the next day. I'd been dreading leaving him alone in the house with Carl even for a few hours. That's when I remembered the home health nurse the hospital had assigned. Her name was Autumn, and she was supposed to start doing regular check-ins this week. I called the nursing service and explained the situation, asked if Autumn could come stay at the house during Nate's appointment instead of her usual afternoon visit. The coordinator said she'd check and called me back 20 minutes later. Autumn had agreed to come at 8 in the morning and stay until we got back from the clinic. The next morning, Autumn showed up right on time. She was probably in her 40s, with short gray hair and this no-nonsense way of walking into the house like she owned it. I explained quickly about Carl packing to leave and how I didn't want Nate alone with him. She nodded once and said she understood completely. Then she positioned herself in the living room where she could see both the front door and the hallway to the bedrooms. Carl came out around 8:30 and stopped when he saw Autumn sitting there. She introduced herself as Nate's nurse and said she'd be staying for a few hours. Carl's face went red, but he didn't say anything, just grabbed another box and went back to packing. I drove Nate to the oncology clinic, which took about 30 minutes in morning traffic. The waiting room had that chemical smell mixed with air freshener that all medical buildings seem to have. We checked in at the front desk and sat down in the plastic chairs near the window. Nate leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. His skin looked pale under the fluorescent lights, and I noticed his hands were trembling again. A nurse called his name after about 10 minutes, and we followed her back to one of the treatment rooms. The room had 2 big reclining chairs, medical equipment on rolling carts, and cheerful posters about staying positive during treatment. Dr. Sanford came in a few minutes later with Nate's chart. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray streaks in her dark hair. She asked Nate how he was feeling, checked his vitals, and looked over his recent blood work results. Then she turned to me and asked how his recovery environment was going at home. I hesitated for a second, not sure how much to share. But then I figured his doctor should know about major stress factors. I explained that we were removing a significant source of stress from the household, that my husband had been making Nate's recovery much harder and was now moving out. Dr. Sanford nodded slowly and said something that surprised me. She said emotional stability could genuinely impact treatment outcomes. That stress hormones affect the immune system, and creating a peaceful environment wasn't just about comfort. It could actually help Nate's body respond better to the chemotherapy. She wrote something in his chart and said she was glad we were taking steps to protect his recovery space. After the appointment, Dr. Sanford walked us out to the waiting area. A man was standing near the reception desk talking to one of the nurses. He looked up when we came out and Dr. Sanford smiled. She introduced him as her husband and said his name was Felix. He worked as a hospital social worker in the building next door. Felix shook my hand and said his wife had mentioned our family was going through a difficult time. He asked if I'd considered joining a support group for caregivers of cancer patients. I admitted I hadn't really thought about it. Felix pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. He said many caregivers face relationship strain during treatment, that I shouldn't feel alone in choosing my child's well-being over my marriage. The support group met every Thursday evening in the hospital's community room. He said I might find it helpful to talk with other people who understood the impossible choices cancer forces families to make. I took Felix's card and thanked him for thinking of us. He told me the support group had helped a lot of families through similar situations. Dr. Sanford squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of the steps we were taking to protect Nate's recovery. We drove home in comfortable silence, and I noticed Nate looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. The tension that usually lived in his shoulders seemed lighter somehow. When we got back to the house, Carl's truck was gone from the driveway. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was wound so tight. Autumn met us at the door and said Carl had finished loading his things about an hour ago. She mentioned he tried to take some kitchen appliances that were clearly mine, but she stopped him and made him put them back. I thanked her for staying and asked if she could come back regularly to help with Nate's care. She agreed immediately and said she'd be here 3 times a week to check his vitals and help with the port care. After Autumn left, Nate and I just stood in the living room looking around. The house felt different already, like we could finally breathe in our own space. That night, we ordered pizza from Nate's favorite place, the one Carl always said was too greasy and refused to eat. We set up in the living room with the medical equipment right there in plain sight, something Carl would have complained about endlessly. Nate picked a movie he'd been wanting to watch, and we didn't worry about the volume or whether the light from the TV would bother anyone. I watched my son laugh at something on screen, really laugh, and realized I hadn't heard that sound in months. The simple act of relaxing in our own home without walking on eggshells felt almost strange. Over the next week, I threw myself into making the house a real recovery space for Nate. I moved furniture in his room so he could reach everything he needed without getting up too much. His medications went into a proper organizer with alarms so we wouldn't miss doses. I planned meals around his nausea patterns, keeping bland foods ready for bad days, and his favorites available when he felt better. The spare bedroom became a quiet space where he could rest when the living room felt too bright or loud. I bought blackout curtains and a white noise machine. Small things that Carl would have mocked as coddling, but that actually helped Nate sleep better between treatments. On Wednesday, Autumn showed up right on time for her first official visit. She checked Nate's blood pressure, temperature, and oxygen levels while asking him questions about his symptoms. Then she examined the port in his chest where the chemo went in, cleaning around it carefully and checking for any signs of infection. While she worked, she commented that Nate seemed much more engaged than during her first visit. His answers were longer, his eye contact better. I explained about Carl moving out and how the stress level in the house had dropped dramatically. Autumn nodded, like this made perfect sense, and said she'd seen it before with other patients. Toxic family members could genuinely impact recovery outcomes. Friday afternoon, someone knocked on the door, and I opened it to find a young woman about Nate's age holding a shopping bag. She introduced herself as Chloe, Nate's friend from college. I remembered her from before Nate got sick, but I hadn't seen her since his diagnosis. Chloe explained that she'd wanted to visit earlier, but Carl had made her feel so unwelcome the one time she tried that she'd been afraid to come back. She'd called Nate yesterday, and he told her Carl was gone, so she hoped it was okay to stop by now. I invited her in immediately, and Nate's whole face lit up when he saw her. Chloe pulled board games out of her bag and spread them across the coffee table. For the next 3 hours, I heard Nate laughing and joking with his friend, sounding more like his old self than he had in months. Chloe treated him completely normally, teasing him about bad game moves and arguing over rules, not tiptoeing around his illness like he was made of glass. When she left, she hugged him carefully and promised to come back soon. Nate was smiling as he headed to his room for a nap, and I felt grateful that Carl's absence was letting his friends back into his life. My phone buzzed that evening with a text from Carl. It was a long message about how sorry he was, how he'd been under so much stress, how he wanted to work things out. I deleted it without responding. An hour later, another text came through, this one angry, calling me selfish for choosing Nate over our marriage. Then another apology. Then one calling me manipulative. The messages kept coming, swinging wildly between remorse and blame. Finally, one came through calling me a witch who had turned his stepson against him, and I'd had enough. I blocked Carl's number and felt relieved when my phone went quiet. The next morning, Matthew called. He apologized again for his brother's behavior and said Carl was staying with him temporarily while looking for his own place. Matthew's voice sounded tired as he explained that Carl complained constantly about being the victim, showed no real understanding of why we'd kicked him out. According to Matthew, Carl was telling everyone that Nate had manipulated me into choosing him over my husband. I thanked Matthew for everything he'd done to help with the move, but I told him I needed space from anything Carl-related right now. Matthew understood completely and said he'd only reach out if there was a genuine emergency. 2 days later, Nate had his next round of chemotherapy scheduled. I drove him to the hospital early in the morning, and the treatment hit him harder than the previous one had. By the time we got home, he was pale and shaking, barely able to walk from the car to his room, but having a peaceful home made such a difference in his recovery. I could play soft music without worrying about Carl complaining. I kept the lights dim throughout the house. I focused entirely on Nate's comfort, bringing him water and crackers, helping him to the bathroom, sitting with him when the nausea got bad. There was no one making gagging noises or spraying air freshener or commenting about how disgusting it all was. Just quiet support and care. A week after that treatment, we went back to Dr. Sanford's office for blood work results. She looked over the numbers carefully before telling us that Nate's white blood cell count was improving. He wasn't out of danger yet, and the treatment still had a long way to go, but the progress was genuine and encouraging. Dr. Sanford emphasized how important it was to maintain the low-stress environment we'd created. She said emotional stability affected the immune system in measurable ways, and removing Carl from the house had likely contributed to Nate's improved numbers. The next day, Felix called to check in on us. He asked how we were managing financially with all the medical bills piling up. I admitted it was getting scary, that I was worried about being able to afford Nate's medications on top of everything else. Felix said he'd been looking into some options and thought he could connect us with a financial assistance program through the hospital. He walked me through the application process over the phone, and by the end of the call, he'd submitted everything we needed. 3 days later, Felix called back to say we'd been approved. The program would cover a significant portion of Nate's medication costs going forward. I hung up the phone and cried with relief, overwhelmed by the kindness of people who barely knew us but wanted to help anyway. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The caregiver support group met in a church basement every Tuesday evening. I walked in nervous, not sure what to expect, and found about 15 people sitting in a circle of folding chairs. A woman named Patricia ran the group and welcomed me warmly, asking me to share my story when I felt ready. I listened to other parents talk about their kids going through cancer treatment. One father described his teenage daughter's bone cancer and how exhausting the hospital stays were. A mother talked about her son's brain tumor and the constant worry that came with every scan. Several people mentioned relationship strain with their partners, and I realized Carl's behavior wasn't completely unique, though his cruelty seemed more extreme than most. One man said his wife couldn't handle seeing their child sick and spent most evenings at her sister's house. Another woman mentioned her husband drank more during their daughter's treatment and became distant. The common thread was partners who couldn't cope and made everything harder instead of being supportive. When Patricia asked if I wanted to share, I told them about Nate's leukemia and about kicking Carl out of the house. The group listened quietly as I explained how Carl had made Nate feel unwelcome in his own home, how he'd endangered Nate's life with the poker party, how he'd suggested nursing homes while Nate was in the ICU. A woman named Jennifer spoke up after I finished. She said she divorced her husband 2 years ago during her daughter's treatment because his stress and complaints made everything worse. Her voice was steady as she explained it was the hardest decision she ever made, but absolutely the right one. Her daughter was in remission now, and Jennifer said removing that toxic stress from their home had helped both of them heal. She looked directly at me and said I'd done the right thing, that protecting my son was what mattered most. Other people nodded, and several shared similar stories of having to choose between their sick child and an unsupportive partner. I left that meeting feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected, knowing other parents understood exactly why I'd made the choice I did. At home, Nate and I started building new routines together. We'd have coffee in the kitchen each morning when he was feeling okay, sitting at the table and talking about nothing important, just enjoying the quiet peace of the house. Afternoon rest periods became standard when his energy dipped, and I'd make sure the house stayed quiet so he could actually sleep without Carl's music or complaints. Evening card games became our favorite activity when his nausea was manageable. We'd play rummy or poker for hours, keeping score on a notepad and laughing at our terrible hands. The rhythm felt natural and healing in ways I hadn't experienced since before Carl moved in. Nate commented one evening that he'd forgotten what it felt like to relax in his own home, to not constantly brace himself for the next cruel comment or passive-aggressive action. I realized I'd been doing the same thing, walking on eggshells in my own house, always worried about Carl's next complaint or deliberate provocation. Now we could just exist without that constant tension. Chloe started visiting twice a week, usually on Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. She'd bring board games or movies, sometimes cooking dinner for all of us when Nate's appetite was good. The second week she visited, she brought 2 other friends from college who wanted to support Nate. A guy named Ryan and a girl named Sophie showed up with pizza and a stack of video games. They treated Nate normally, joking with him and including him in conversations without tiptoeing around his illness or treating him like he was fragile. The house filled with young voices and laughter, the kind of energy that had been completely absent during Carl's time here. Carl had preferred oppressive silence, complaining if Nate made any noise or had friends over. Now the living room buzzed with life, and I could see Nate's spirits lift with each visit. He smiled more, engaged more, seemed more like himself than he had in months. My phone buzzed one evening with a notification from Nate's laptop. He'd set up his social media to alert me if Carl tried to contact him, and sure enough, there were 3 messages from Carl in his inbox. The first one talked about how hurt Carl was, how he'd made mistakes but wanted to make things right. The second one asked Nate to convince me to reconsider, saying we were a family and families work through problems. The third one got manipulative, saying Nate must know how much stress Carl was under and how unfair it was to kick him out during such a difficult time. Nate blocked Carl immediately when I showed him the messages. He said he wanted me to know what Carl tried so there wouldn't be any secrets or ways for Carl to manipulate either of us separately. I was proud of how clearly Nate saw through Carl's tactics, how he didn't fall for the guilt trips or emotional manipulation. My brother-in-law called a few days later to check in and mentioned something interesting. Carl had apparently contacted him about challenging the eviction legally, asking if there was any way to claim rights to the house or force his way back in. My brother-in-law told Carl he had absolutely no legal standing since his name wasn't on the deed. He'd never paid rent and there was no legal agreement giving him any claim to the property. He said pursuing it would be a complete waste of money that Carl would lose, which apparently ended that conversation immediately. My brother-in-law sounded amused as he relayed this, saying Carl seemed genuinely shocked that being married to me didn't automatically give him ownership rights. I thanked him for shutting that down quickly and for continuing to help us navigate the legal side of removing Carl from our lives. I started going through our finances and realized the mess Carl had left behind was worse than I'd thought. He'd maxed out 2 credit cards that had my name on them, spending money on things I never saw or benefited from. The statements showed charges at bars, restaurants, sporting goods stores, all things Carl bought for himself while complaining that Nate was a financial burden. I made an appointment with a financial advisor to figure out how to separate our finances completely and protect my credit from any more damage Carl might try to cause. The advisor was a woman named Linda who specialized in helping people untangle shared finances during separations. She reviewed all our accounts and credit cards, making notes about what was joint and what was separate. Linda explained that since the house was only in my and Nate's names, Carl couldn't claim any equity even though we were still legally married. She said the fact that he'd never contributed to mortgage payments and wasn't on the deed meant he had no financial claim to the property at all. That was a relief to hear confirmed by a professional. Linda helped me start the process of removing Carl from the joint credit cards and closing the accounts he'd maxed out. She also suggested I pull my credit report to make sure Carl hadn't opened anything else in my name without telling me. I started researching divorce procedures that evening, reading about what was required in our state and how long the process typically took. Linda had mentioned that I should wait until Nate's health was more stable before filing, since divorce proceedings could be stressful, and I needed to focus my energy on Nate's recovery right now. But knowing the information and having a plan made me feel more in control of the situation. Nate had a particularly good week where his energy levels improved noticeably. His nausea was manageable with medication, and he actually felt like eating regular meals instead of just crackers and soup. We took short walks around the neighborhood in the early evening when the air was cooler. The first walk was just to the end of our block and back, but by the end of the week we were making it around the whole block without him needing to stop and rest. During one of these walks, Nate said he'd forgotten what it felt like to be relaxed in his own home, to not constantly feel like he was intruding or being judged. He said the difference in his stress levels was huge, that he could actually focus on getting better, instead of managing Carl's hostility on top of managing cancer. I squeezed his hand and told him that's exactly what I wanted, for him to be able to heal without additional burdens. We had an appointment with Dr. Sanford at the end of that good week. She reviewed Nate's latest blood work and examined him carefully, asking detailed questions about his symptoms and energy levels. After reviewing everything, she said she wanted to adjust his treatment protocol based on his improved response to the chemotherapy. The current drugs were working better than she'd initially projected, and his body was tolerating them well. She explained the adjustments she wanted to make and what we could expect in terms of side effects and recovery time. Then she looked at both of us and said she was cautiously optimistic that we were seeing real progress. Her exact words were that the leukemia was responding to treatment in encouraging ways, though she reminded us that this was a marathon and not a sprint. There would be months more of treatment ahead, possibly years of maintenance therapy, but the trajectory was good. Nate and I left that appointment feeling hopeful for the first time since his diagnosis, like maybe we really could beat this thing. The next afternoon, Travis stopped by while I was checking the mail. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking uncomfortable about whatever he needed to say. He mentioned he'd seen Carl's car drive past the house twice in the past week, both times going really slow, like he was checking to see who was home. I thanked Travis for telling me and went inside to call the police non-emergency line. The woman who answered took down all the information about the drive-bys and Carl's previous eviction. She said they'd create a report to start a paper trail in case Carl tried anything worse later. Having it documented made me feel slightly better, like we had some protection if things got bad. 2 days later, the officer who'd supervised Carl's move called to check in. He asked if Carl had tried to contact us or come back to the property. I told him about the drive-bys Travis witnessed. The officer suggested I said I wanted to wait and see if Carl would stop on his own first, that maybe he just needed time to accept the situation. The officer said that was my choice, but to call immediately if Carl approached the house or tried to contact either of us directly. Autumn came for her regular visit that Thursday morning. She took Nate's blood pressure and temperature, checked his port site, and asked her usual questions about symptoms and medication side effects. While she was packing up her supplies, she commented that Nate seemed different lately, more engaged and positive than during her first few visits. She said she'd worked with cancer patients for 15 years and could tell when someone's mental state improved. Autumn explained that positive mental health genuinely helped physical recovery from cancer treatment, that stress and depression could actually make side effects worse and slow healing. She shared a story about another patient whose cancer responded better to treatment after his family removed a toxic girlfriend from his life. The difference in his recovery speed was dramatic once he wasn't dealing with constant emotional abuse on top of fighting the disease. That evening, I sat down at my computer and searched for support groups for parents of adult children with cancer. I found an online forum with hundreds of members from all over the country. I created an account and spent hours reading through posts from other parents dealing with similar situations. Several members shared stories about having to make hard choices about partners who weren't supportive during their child's illness. One woman wrote about divorcing her husband because he kept pressuring their daughter to go back to work during chemotherapy. Another talked about kicking out her boyfriend who complained about medical bills. Reading these stories made me feel less alone, like I wasn't crazy or selfish for choosing Nate over Carl. I posted my own story in the introduction section, keeping it brief but honest about what happened. A few evenings later, Nate and I were sitting in the living room watching a cooking show. During a commercial break, he said something that caught me off guard. He told me he'd been feeling guilty about causing my marriage to end, that he kept thinking maybe he should have just tried to deal with Carl's behavior to keep the peace. I turned off the TV and looked at him directly. I explained that Carl's cruelty was Carl's choice, not something Nate caused by being sick. I told him that protecting him was my choice too, and I would make the same decision again without any hesitation. Nate's eyes got watery, but he nodded and said he was starting to understand that talking to the other young adults in his cancer support group helped him see the situation more clearly. Chloe showed up Saturday afternoon with her laptop tucked under her arm. She asked Nate if he wanted to video call some of their friends from college who'd been asking about him. Nate's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. Chloe set up the laptop at the kitchen table and spent the next 2 hours helping Nate reconnect with people he'd lost touch with during treatment. I could hear laughter coming from the kitchen, actual genuine laughter that made my chest feel lighter. Later, Chloe told me that social connection was just as important as medicine for Nate's recovery. That feeling isolated made everything harder. I hugged her and thanked her for being such a good friend to my son. My phone buzzed with a text from Matthew on Sunday morning. He wrote that Carl had moved out of his place and was staying with some friend now. Matthew said he'd tried multiple times to get Carl to see a therapist to work through his anger and resentment, but Carl insisted everyone else was the problem and he didn't need help. Matthew apologized again for his brother's behavior and said he hoped Nate was doing better. I texted back a brief thank you and left it at that. I didn't have energy to discuss Carl with anyone right now. Wednesday evening was my caregiver support group meeting at the community center. When it was my turn to share, I told the group about having to choose between my son and my husband, about kicking Carl out to protect Nate's health and safety. The response from the other caregivers was overwhelming. Several people said I modeled the kind of courage they wished they'd had when facing similar situations. One father said he let his wife's negativity poison his daughter's recovery environment and regretted it deeply. Another mother said she was currently struggling with a partner who resented her son's illness, and hearing my story gave her strength to consider making changes. Walking out of that meeting, I felt validated in a way I desperately needed. Thursday afternoon brought news that made everything feel worthwhile. Dr. Sanford called me into her office after examining Nate. She pulled up his latest scan results on her computer screen and pointed to several areas. The leukemia was responding to treatment better than she'd projected initially. The cancer markers in his blood were dropping faster than expected, and the bone marrow biopsy showed significant improvement. She was careful to say we weren't done yet, that Nate still had months of treatment ahead, and we needed to stay vigilant. But this was genuinely good news, the kind of progress that gave real hope for long-term remission. That night felt like a celebration was actually appropriate for once. Nate requested his favorite restaurant, a Thai place that made this coconut curry he'd been craving for weeks. I ordered delivery, and we set the table with real plates instead of eating from containers. We talked carefully about future plans, not wanting to jinx anything, but allowing ourselves to hope for the first time in months. Nate mentioned maybe going back to finish his degree once he was in remission. I talked about the vegetable garden I wanted to plant in the spring. We didn't make any concrete promises to the universe, just let ourselves imagine a future where cancer wasn't the center of everything. I scheduled an appointment with a divorce attorney the following week. The office was downtown in a plain brick building with worn carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed. The attorney was a woman in her 50s who looked tired but competent. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and asked me basic questions about the marriage. How long we'd been married, whether we had kids together, what assets we shared. I explained that we'd been married 3 years, no children together, and the house belonged to me and my son from my first marriage. She nodded and made notes. She asked about bank accounts, and I told her we had one joint checking account that Carl used for groceries sometimes, but my main accounts were separate. She said that would make things easier. She explained the divorce process in straightforward terms, no legal jargon that would confuse me. I'd need to file a petition, serve Carl with papers, wait through a mandatory separation period. Since we had no shared property and no kids, the whole thing should take about 6 months if Carl didn't fight it. She asked if I thought he would contest the divorce. I said probably not, since he seemed more interested in playing victim than actually fixing anything. She wrote that down too. The consultation lasted 40 minutes and cost $200, but I left feeling like I finally had a clear path forward instead of just existing in this weird limbo. The attorney brought up something I hadn't considered. She said Carl's documented harassment of my son, combined with the eviction circumstances, would work strongly in my favor if Carl tried to claim spousal support or any financial settlement. I'd brought copies of the eviction papers and some text messages where Carl complained about Nate being a burden. She looked through everything carefully and said this created a clear pattern of behavior that no judge would reward. She mentioned that deliberately endangering a cancer patient by inviting sick people into the home could even be considered reckless endangerment in some contexts. I felt this huge sense of relief wash over me. All those months of documenting Carl's cruelty, keeping records of his behavior, noting down the worst incidents, it wasn't just my hurt feelings or overreaction. It was actual evidence that protected me legally. She made copies of everything I brought and added them to my file. She said to keep documenting anything Carl tried going forward, any contact attempts or harassment, because it would only strengthen my case. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in months, knowing I had real legal protection instead of just hoping Carl would leave us alone. Travis stopped me in the driveway a few days later while I was getting the mail. He mentioned casually that he hadn't seen Carl's car drive by in about 2 weeks now. I realized as he said it that I'd stopped watching for Carl constantly. For the first few weeks after the eviction, I'd been jumping at every car sound, checking the windows whenever I heard an engine, keeping my phone close in case Carl showed up and caused problems. But somewhere along the way, that hypervigilance had faded without me noticing. I wasn't constantly braced for confrontation anymore. I could sit in my living room without watching the street. I could focus on Nate's care without part of my brain always scanning for threats. Travis said he'd keep an eye out anyway, just to be safe, but it seemed like Carl had finally accepted he wasn't welcome here. I thanked him for watching out for us and went back inside. The house felt different now, safer somehow, like we could actually relax instead of constantly preparing for the next attack. That evening, I realized I'd gone the whole day without thinking about Carl once, and that felt like progress. Autumn showed up for her regular check on Nate with a folder of information she'd printed out. She said she'd been talking to some colleagues at the hospital about resources for young adults with cancer, and they'd mentioned a support group that met twice a month specifically for people in their 20s dealing with cancer treatment. The group was facilitated by a social worker and met at the community center near the hospital. She thought Nate might benefit from meeting people his own age who understood what he was going through, since most cancer support groups skewed older and had different concerns. I brought the information to Nate after Autumn left. He looked through the flyer without much enthusiasm at first. He'd gotten used to isolation during treatment, pulling away from friends who didn't understand and couldn't relate to suddenly being sick at 24. But I pointed out that these would be people who got it, who were living the same reality he was. He said he'd think about it. 2 days later, he asked if I could drive him to the next meeting. I felt hopeful that he was willing to try, that he wanted to connect with people again, instead of just retreating further into himself. The young adult cancer group met on Thursday evenings in a conference room at the community center. I drove Nate to his first meeting and waited in the parking lot, giving him space but staying close in case he needed to leave early. He was in there for 90 minutes. When he came out, his face looked different, more open than it had been in months. On the drive home, he told me about the people he'd met. There was a woman his age who'd finished treatment for lymphoma 2 years ago and was back in college now. A guy who'd had bone cancer and lost part of his leg, but was training for a marathon on a prosthetic. Another woman currently in treatment like Nate, who talked about her plans to travel once she hit remission. Hearing their stories, seeing people who'd survived and were building real lives after cancer, gave him something the doctors couldn't provide. It was proof that life could continue, that this disease wasn't a death sentence, that he could have a future beyond hospital rooms and chemo schedules. He said he wanted to go back to the next meeting. I felt grateful to Autumn for bringing us that information, for thinking about what Nate needed beyond just medical care. Nate went to 3 more meetings over the next month and a half. Each time he came home a little more energized, a little more hopeful about his future. At his next appointment, Dr. Sanford pulled me aside while Nate was getting blood drawn. She wanted to discuss his long-term treatment plan, now that he was responding so well to chemotherapy. She explained that Nate would need maintenance therapy for years, probably low-dose chemo and regular monitoring, but the prognosis was genuinely good. She used words like remission and survival rate and 5-year outlook, terms that felt almost impossible to believe after months of just trying to keep him alive day to day. She said his positive response to treatment was partly due to his age and overall health before diagnosis, but she also credited the stable home environment we'd created. Stress impacts treatment outcomes more than people realize, she said. Patients who feel safe and supported tend to respond better to therapy. She didn't know the details of what we'd been through with Carl, but she could see the difference in Nate's demeanor over the past few months. I thanked her, and felt this overwhelming sense that kicking Carl out had been the right choice, that protecting Nate's peace had literally helped save his life. I woke up one morning without a headache for the first time in months. I'd been having tension headaches almost daily during Carl's time in the house, plus sleeping badly, waking up multiple times a night, never feeling fully rested. I'd normalized these symptoms, figured they were just part of being a caregiver under stress. But as the weeks passed after Carl left, I realized my body was healing too. The headaches stopped. I started sleeping through the night. My stomach problems cleared up. I had more energy during the day. My own health had been suffering under the constant stress of managing Carl's hostility while caring for Nate, and I hadn't even fully recognized how bad it had gotten. Now that the household tension was gone, my physical symptoms disappeared. I could focus on taking care of Nate without my own body breaking down from the strain. It made me angry in retrospect, realizing how much Carl's presence had damaged both of us. But mostly I just felt grateful that we were both recovering now. Chloe came over one Saturday afternoon and asked if we could talk privately. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee while Nate napped in his room. She said she'd been thinking about our situation and wanted to make an offer. Her current apartment lease was ending next month, and instead of renewing, she wondered if she could move into our spare bedroom. She'd pay rent, split utilities, help with Nate's care when needed. The rent money would help us with medical bills, and having another person in the house would mean I wasn't solely responsible for everything. I told her I needed to discuss it with Nate first since he co-owned the house, and this would affect him too. That evening I brought it up with Nate. His face lit up at the idea. He said having Chloe around made everything feel more normal, less like a medical facility and more like a home. We talked through the practical details, what rent would be fair, how we'd handle household responsibilities, whether Chloe understood the reality of living with someone in cancer treatment. The next day, I called Chloe and told her yes. Suddenly, our home felt like it was becoming a real family space again. Not the tense battlefield it had been with Carl, but a place where people actually cared about each other. Chloe moved in 3 weeks later with enthusiasm and respect that felt completely different from Carl's entitled attitude. She brought her furniture for the spare bedroom, her books and plants and artwork that made the space feel lived in. She immediately asked about house rules, about what times to keep quiet for Nate's rest periods, about cleaning schedules and food arrangements. She wanted to fit into our household, not force us to accommodate her. The first week she was there, she cooked dinner twice without being asked, cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, and spent an evening setting up a video game system in the living room so she and Nate could play together when he felt up to it. Her presence added life to the house without any of the toxicity Carl had brought. She'd laugh with Nate about college memories, include me in their conversations, respect when Nate needed quiet or when I was stressed about medical appointments. The house felt warm again, like a place where people actually wanted to be, instead of a prison we were all trapped in. 6 months after Carl's eviction, I finally filed for divorce with my attorney's help. The paperwork went through the court system without any contest from Carl. He never responded to the petition, never tried to fight the terms, never showed up for any hearings. My attorney said this meant he'd either accepted the situation or moved on to other concerns. I suspected he'd found someone else to manipulate, some new person who didn't know his patterns yet. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a brief court hearing where the judge reviewed the uncontested petition and signed the decree. I walked out of the courthouse feeling free in a way I hadn't felt since before I married Carl. That evening, Nate, Chloe, and I celebrated with takeout from Nate's favorite restaurant. We didn't make a big deal of it, didn't throw a party or anything dramatic, just quietly acknowledged that this chapter was finally closed. Nate raised his glass of juice and said he was proud of me for choosing us over Carl. Chloe agreed. I felt like we were finally building the life we deserved, one where cancer was the main challenge we faced, not deliberate cruelty from someone who should have been supporting us. Nate's next chemo session went better than any of us expected. He sat in the treatment chair for 4 hours while the medication dripped into his port, and he barely felt sick afterward. Dr. Sanford came by to check his vitals and review his latest blood work. She said his white blood cell count was holding steady, his platelets looked good, and his body was handling the treatment better than most patients she'd seen. She pulled me aside in the hallway and mentioned that Nate's positive attitude was probably helping more than he realized. Stress weakened the immune system, and removing Carl from our home had eliminated a major source of daily stress. She said she'd seen patients turn around completely once toxic people left their lives, and Nate seemed to be following that pattern. I felt relief wash over me knowing we'd made the right choice. When we got home that evening, Nate actually had enough energy to help me make dinner. He chopped vegetables while I cooked chicken, and we talked about normal things like what movie we wanted to watch later. It felt almost normal, like we were just a regular family doing regular things instead of fighting cancer every single day. The three of us fell into comfortable routines over the next few weeks. Friday nights became movie night where we'd order pizza and watch whatever Nate picked. Chloe always made popcorn with extra butter, and we'd pile blankets on the couch and just relax together. Sunday mornings meant breakfast together at the kitchen table. Chloe would make pancakes, I'd cook eggs and bacon, and Nate would set the table and pour orange juice. We'd sit there for hours sometimes, just talking and laughing about nothing important. The house felt warm and alive in ways it never had when Carl lived here. There was no tension hanging in the air, no walking on eggshells, no wondering when the next cruel comment would come. Chloe fit into our little family perfectly. She respected Nate's need for quiet when he felt sick. She helped with cleaning without being asked, and she made both of us laugh when we needed it most. Having her there meant I wasn't carrying everything alone anymore, and Nate had someone his own age to talk to about normal things. My brother-in-law came over for dinner on a Thursday evening. I'd made lasagna, Nate's favorite meal, and we all sat around the dining room table together. He looked around the house and commented on how different everything felt now. He said Nate looked healthier, that there was color in his face again, and that I seemed happier and less stressed than he'd seen me in years. He told us that helping us evict Carl was one of the most satisfying legal cases he'd ever handled. Most of his work involved boring paperwork and difficult divorces, but getting to help family and remove someone genuinely harmful from our lives felt meaningful. He said he'd worried about me during those months with Carl, that he'd seen how drained I looked whenever he visited, but he hadn't wanted to overstep. Now he could see we were healing, both of us, and that made him glad he'd been able to help. Nate thanked him for stepping in when we needed it, and my brother-in-law just smiled and said that's what family does. One evening, about a week later, Nate and I sat together on the front porch watching the sun go down. The sky turned orange and pink, and the air was cool, but not cold. Nate was wrapped in a blanket and I had my coffee mug warming my hands. He turned to me and said thank you for choosing him when it mattered most. His voice was quiet but steady. I felt tears start to form, but I blinked them back and told him there was never really a choice to make. Protecting your child is what love looks like, and I was grateful we both got to heal together in the home that was always meant to be ours. He nodded and looked back at the sunset. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, just being together. His next treatment was scheduled for the following week, and Dr. Sanford had mentioned that if his numbers kept improving, we might be looking at genuine hope for remission. Our family looked different now than it had a year ago, smaller but stronger, and we were facing the future together with real hope instead of just survival. Well, that's another inspiring disaster wrapped up. If you made it to the end, you clearly enjoy watching chaos unfold. Subscribe and let's keep making bad choices together.